Today we're going to be looking at how effective is the Supreme Court. We're going to be looking at what its underlying principles are and assessing how effective are they in fulfilling those principles, as well as why are those principles so important. So something to recap and think about from last lesson is what sort of cases does the Supreme Court take, and why is it important that the courts are supreme? So they take a variety of cases. Most of the things the Supreme Court do is applying and interpreting EU law and adding it to British law. They also seek to uphold the rule of law, the idea that nobody, no individual or no government is above law, above protecting the human rights of society. So things like upholding the right to a fair trial and equality under law. They're also the final stage of appeal for more civil court orders as well, which we're going to look at one of those in detail today. So how can you become a Supreme Court Justice? So this man here is the current president of the Supreme Court, a man called Lord Reed. He is one of 12 members of Supreme Court Justices, so there's a total of 12. Not all 12 members are used for every single court case, so they tend to have, they need to have an odd number for their court cases, because then that just makes the decision easier, because it means that there's always going to be a majority. So they'll use a higher number of judges for cases which are deemed to be more serious and more complicated. For example, when the Supreme Court reviewed whether or not Parliament should be able to decide how Brexit is triggered, the triggering of Article 50, they used 11 judges on that case. They also used 11 judges in 2019 on whether or not Boris Johnson acted ultra vires beyond powers when he prorogued Parliament. So in order to be a Supreme Court Justice, you would have had to have served as a senior judge for 2 years or a qualified lawyer for 15 years. And you are nominated by an independent 5-member selections committee. So it's quite important, this idea of judicial independence, which we're going to look at in more detail shortly. But they are nominated independently by a selections commission. And then once that commission has made its decision, it is confirmed or rejected by the Lord Chancellor. So the key operating principles of the Supreme Court then. So if we're having a look at this image is a representation of justice or Lady Justice. There's 3 things which I think stand out in this picture. One thing is obviously the sword, and that's this idea that when it comes to judging and when it comes to making a decision, it will be upheld. You also have the idea of a scale and about being impartial and being balanced. You can see here that she is also blindfolded, and the blindness is supposed to represent this idea of neutrality, which is that the justice system doesn't take into account your background, it doesn't take into account your creed, your colour, your gender, or anything else. It only looks at the facts, the case, and it means that everybody will be equally judged before the law. So this principle of neutrality is a key operating principle of the Supreme Court, and this is this idea of judicial neutrality. So the principle that judges should not be influenced by their personal political opinions and should remain outside of party politics. So they shouldn't make a judgment based on if they vote Conservative, if they vote Labour. The only thing they should be taking into account when they're ruling on a case is what are the facts and how can we best uphold equality before the law. So they need to fulfill their role without personal bias. They also sign up to a code of conduct which is established to safeguard impartiality. So this is created in order to avoid conflict of interest cases and political activity as well, which makes the British Supreme Court very different to the American Supreme Court, where there is a lot of partisan politics involved. So it's so important that the judges are neutral because it just upholds the idea of equality before the law. So how effective is the Supreme Court in actually being neutral? So you can see here, this is an image of the Supreme Court as of 2020. And I think there's something here that stands out almost immediately when you're looking at this, which could be a potential barrier to judicial neutrality. And I wonder if you can see it straight away. I think the first thing that actually screams out to us is the fact that it is one race of people, that it is very white. Also, the fact that there are only two women there as well. So, in any case, women will be a minority voice in any case. And this can cause quite a lot of issues. And I think this case is quite effective in symbolizing some of those issues. So you have this case in 2010, which was about a prenuptial agreement signed in Germany at the time of marriage. So when these two individuals were married, they were married in Germany. The man is French and the woman is German. And they were married in Germany and they decided to sign a prenuptial agreement. What that effectively means is if they get divorced, there won't be anybody trying to claim half of the other person's money. And essentially, what happens then is Nicholas Granatino, so the man in this case, he asks for a higher divorce settlement. So they end up spending most of their married life together in London. So when they become divorced, they do so in London. And in order to uphold the prenup, then it would need to be based on British laws. In Britain, we do not have any laws which guarantee the rights of prenups. We do not recognise prenups in British law. So technically, according to the British law, he would be entitled to a higher portion of a divorce settlement. However, she said, my prenup stands, even if we are in a different country, you need to respect the prenup that we signed when we were married because it was an agreement that you wouldn't be coming for extra parts of my money. So he takes this to the courts and he ends up escalating it all the way up to the High Court. The High Court then decides that actually, no, we are going to respect the prenup. And you were complaining about getting £5 million, but she's been quite generous with that. And we're going to say she only has to actually give you £1 million instead. And he argues that this will leave him in financial ruin. And because he felt that the High Court was unfair, he disagreed with the ruling, he ends up actually escalating this to the Supreme Court. Now, this going up to the Supreme Court is extremely significant because what is decided in the Supreme Court sets a precedence for changes in UK law. So if the Supreme Court rule in favour of the prenup and protecting and upholding the prenup, then what would happen then is that it would create a case law, which would make that applicable to English law and Welsh law as well. So this could effectively change the way that prenups are viewed in the UK. Supreme Court then takes the case and they actually rule in favour of Radhika. So they rule in favour of the person trying to advocate that the prenup should be respected, and they rule in favour of her 8-1. Only one judge dissents, and the person who just dissents, the person who disagrees with the verdict quite ardently, is Lady Hale. So Lady Hale disagrees with this verdict, and it's an interesting one because it's if you're thinking about it, this is a woman who is arguing that she is entitled to her money. And he was making the argument that he had to sacrifice his career in order to raise the children. We don't usually hear this argument this way round. And Lady Hale says, if you make this case, if you allow Radhika to keep her money and you don't give a fair amount of money to her spouse, this is actually going to impact quite negatively on women because women are the ones who tend to give up their careers, not go for promotions and those sorts of things, and as a result end up becoming financially less well off than men. So men actually tend to, in relationships, benefit from being married because they have someone at home who takes on a lot of the domestic burdens, whereas a woman has to basically give up parts of her career and her career progression. So she says that by following this, we're setting this precedent, which essentially means that men don't have to follow their responsibility of marriage and upholding and kind of almost paying women back for their services in that marriage as well. So she disagreed with that verdict. And I think this is quite an important case for the importance of having a more balanced Supreme Court. And that is because as those men in that circumstance, they won't quite understand the intricacies of the sacrifices that women would have to make in the same way. In the same way that people of colour being underrepresented is quite a serious issue and a serious sort of oversight in the justice system, being that the sort of things that this group of people have experienced is going to not quite represent the majority of the country. There's also the fact that most people in the Supreme Court went to independent schools as well, so they don't. Not only is there a gender imbalance and a race imbalance, but there's also a class imbalance too. So there is an issue on this, and it's harder to be neutral when the experiences of a whole body, a whole 12 judges, is so narrowed and doesn't quite represent what normal people in the public do tend to experience and understand. So the second principle of the Supreme Court is this idea of judicial independence. So what this means is that judges should not be influenced by other branches of government, particularly the executive. So this is so crucial, because if one of the roles of the Supreme Court is to hold the government to account, to uphold the rule of law, and ensure that the government is not acting beyond powers and violating people's human rights, the Supreme Court needs to be able to do that effectively. However, if the Supreme Court or justices on the Supreme Court owe their position to a political party or a person in government, then they're going to be a bit more reluctant in criticising them. If the person who is holding their pay purses and deciding how much they're getting paid and how long they're serving for is a person in government as well, that might have a negative influence on them too, because they might feel encouraged to look more favourably on that individual and not hold them to account as effectively. So this is why it's so important to hold this idea of independence. The Supreme Court is separate from the government, which is important for separation of powers, but they're also separate in terms of appointment, in terms of pay, and in terms of selection as well. So for terms of employment, they can only be removed from office if they break the law. So the Prime Minister can't get fed up with a justice for criticising them too much and remove them. Their pay, their salaries come from independent budgets. So it's not reviewed and decided on by the government. They're also appointed, as we talked about earlier, so this is a transparent process in the selection of judges as well. So these are their two principles, and it's important to consider how effective they are. So in terms of judicial independence, I think that's quite an effective means, and I think they're successfully fulfilling that principle. But there is a massive gap in this idea of judicial neutrality. So there is an article from The Guardian, which I've posted, which you need to have a read and try and really understand what are the issues with not having a representative judiciary, and is it actually possible to uphold neutrality without being representative as well?